Welcome back to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. We're starting today with a really powerful quote, I think. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. That message definitely sets the stage for today's deep dive into the climate crisis. We're going to focus on something critical, the distinction that often gets missed, I feel, in the public conversation.
Right.
The difference between, gradual warming and what scientists are calling tipping points.
Exactly.
Our insights today are drawn from a really illuminating interview with Dr. Genevieve Guenther. She's a climate communication specialist, and this was published in The Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here is to pull out those crucial insights. These are essential for anyone tracking global current affairs, maybe like you, our UPSC aspirant listeners, but honestly, for any well-informed citizen who wants to grasp the real urgency here. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is that Dr. Guenther, she isn't just looking at the climate science itself. She's the founding director of End Climate Silence.
Right.
So her whole focus is on how global heating is actually represented, especially in the media. It means we're not just talking science today, but also this critical tension around whether we should be discussing the really catastrophic risks openly.
That's a great point, how the whole conversation has shifted.
Exactly, how we talk about it.
Okay, so let's start there. We all kind of get the idea of gradual climate change, right? CO2 levels rising, sea levels creeping up, oceans getting warmer bit by bit.
Mm-hmm. The incremental stuff.
Exactly. But Dr. Guenther introduces these tipping points as something, fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help us and our listeners really understand that distinction?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so important to think beyond just that slow, incremental change?
Absolutely. So think of the gradual changes, like walking slowly and steadily up a hill. It's noticeable but predictable.
Okay.
Tipping points, though, are like reaching the very, very top of that hill, or maybe even the edge of a cliff, where just a tiny nudge, a tiny shift, as Dr. Guenther calls it.
Just a small thing.
Yeah, a really small thing could suddenly cause huge parts of the Earth system to change dramatically and, crucially, irreversibly. The effects could be, devastating.
Irreversibly is the key word there.
It really is. And scientists have identified, I think, at least 16 potential tipping points. The big worry isn't just one point, it's how they might interact.
Like a chain reaction.
Exactly. Creating these feedback loops. One change triggers another, which amplifies the first problem, heating the planet even more, or completely messing up weather patterns. And the scary part...
What's that?
We might have already passed some of them. The source mentions things like, massive ice sheets, coral reefs, vital ocean currents like the AMOC.
The Atlantic circulation.
That's the one. And even the Amazon rainforest. These aren't small systems. They're globally important ecosystems pushed towards a point of no return.
That explanation really drives home the significance. But okay, if these tipping points are so profound, why this specific push to talk about these catastrophic risks right now? Isn't the story of gradual warming already alarming enough?
That's a really good question. And Dr. Guenther's perspective is quite clear on this. She argues we need to actively correct a false narrative that the climate threat is under control.
So she thinks there's a sense of complacency creeping in.
Precisely. She emphasizes that these risks, these enormous risks, aren't just possibilities, they're potentially catastrophic. They could literally undo the connections between human and ecological systems.
The very basis of everything.
That form the basis of all of our civilization.
Yeah.
It's not just about things getting hotter, it's about the fundamental systems we rely on potentially collapsing.
Okay, that puts it in stark terms. I remember back in 2018, after that big IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, there was what the source calls a constructive wave of global climate alarm.
Yes, that report really hit hard.
It made it so clear, didn't it? The difference between 1.5C and 2C wasn't small. It was catastrophic for millions. It meant we needed huge emissions cuts immediately.
And it did spark action. You saw Greta Thunberg, indigenous activists, youth movements.
Right, a lot of activism. And the media attention definitely surged. Governments started making new pledges, new policies. It felt like a real shift.
It did feel like a moment of awakening. But then something else happened. As the source points out, there was a kind of backlash, interestingly, from within the climate movement itself.
A backlash, how so?
Well, some people started arguing for cultivating more optimism. Their worry was that all the talk about fear about catastrophe might actually drive away investors.
Ah, the economic argument against alarmism.
Exactly. So they started arguing against discussing these worst-case scenarios. Some commentators even started saying, oh, things are looking better, we're on a more reassuring trajectory now, maybe heading for just under 3 degrees Celsius by 2100.
Just under 3C. Reassuring. How can that possibly be reassuring, given what we know?
Well, that's Dr. Guenther's reaction, too. She finds it, and I quote, bananas to feel reassured by that. She reiterates that 3C would be totally catastrophic for humanity. And she points out, even now, at around 1.5C warming, the impacts we're seeing are often hitting the worst side of what was predicted.
So things are already looking bad, even at this level.
Right, and the concern about those tipping points there about AMOC, Antarctic sea ice, corals, rainforests, it's growing, not shrinking.
She has that analogy, doesn't she, about the plane?
Yes, it's powerful. If the risk of a plane crashing was as high as the risk of the AMOC collapsing, none of us would ever fly.
It really makes you think. This little spaceship, our planet, as she calls it, is at risk of crashing, essentially.
Yet we carry on sort of business as usual. She argues part of the problem is this feeling that the danger is far off, distant.
Especially for future generations, for our kids.
Exactly. We don't fully grasp the chaotic, disastrous, unlivable future we're potentially creating. So talking about these catastrophic risks, she believes, helps bridge that dangerous gap in understanding.
So the fear itself isn't necessarily bad. Dr. Guenther's book actually says it's appropriate to be scared.
Yes, and that the more you know, the more likely you are to be worried. Which makes sense. You hear similar things from top scientists, even the UN Secretary General.
It counters those messages, suggesting, that wealthy countries will be fine, fostering this dangerous complacency.
Right. Her book aims to wake people up, make the issue more salient, and build support for actually phasing out fossil fuels.
There's a nuance there, isn't there, about who this message is for?
Yes, a crucial nuance. While she advocates for this urgency with people who are already engaged, she cautions against using the discourse of catastrophe for those who are completely disengaged.
Why that?
Because it can backfire. It might just overwhelm them, make them shut down, or even dig their heels in if they feel threatened. It's just too threatening sometimes.
Interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all message.
Not at all. And interestingly, a Yale study found that actually a degree of climate anxiety was not necessarily bad. It could actually motivate people towards collective action.
Okay, so anxiety isn't always paralyzing. But what about doomerism? That feeling that it's all hopeless. Dr. Guenther talks about different kinds, right?
She does. She outlines 3 types. First, there's despair that comes from misunderstanding the science, people believing, say, that total collapse is definitely coming in 20 or 30 years. She's very clear. That's not true.
Okay, so that's based on misinformation. What's the second type?
The second is more nihilistic, people who sort of claim they're the only ones brave enough to see the harsh reality. Dr. Guenther expresses, disdain for that position.
Right. And the third?
The third she calls political frustration. This is the feeling that the people in power, governments, corporations are basically happy to burn the world down. And she says this is probably the most reasonable kind of doomerism.
Understandable frustration. So if that's the most reasonable kind, how did she suggest we fight that? What's the antidote?
Her answer is about channeling that feeling. She says, essentially, yes, this is scary as hell, but we must have courage. Yes. And turn our fear into action. That means talking about climate change with others, calling elected officials, regularly demand in workplaces, align their investments with climate safety.
So practical actions.
Practical actions, meeting people where they are emotionally, acknowledging the fear, but then showing how that fear can be eased by cultivating their bravery and collective action. It's about empowerment through doing things together.
That makes sense. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk economics. Dr. Guenther really takes issue with the work of Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus, doesn't she?
She does, quite strongly.
She calls his estimates of climate damages ridiculously lowballed. Given everything we've just discussed about tipping points and catastrophe, how do his models end up so optimistic? Where do they fall short?
It's a really critical point she makes. Nordhaus gets those low numbers, basically, by failing to price the risk of catastrophe.
He just leaves it out.
Largely, yes. And he also omits, as she puts it, a goodly chunk of the costs of global heating. His models don't factor in damages to things like labor productivity, buildings, infrastructure, transport, even non-coastal real estate, insurance, communications. The list goes on.
Wow, that's a lot of omissions.
It is. But the absolute biggest omission the source emphasizes is the risk that heating could trigger actual catastrophes, whether that's physical tipping points like the ice sheets collapsing, or societal ones like wars breaking out over resources.
So the models are fundamentally blind to the biggest dangers.
That's the core insight. These standard economic models, by their very design, systematically ignore the potential for catastrophe, which makes their projections seem much safer than they likely are. She calls this reliance on them a kind of quasi-religious faith in the power of capitalism to decouple itself from the planet.
Which she deems absurd and unscientific.
Exactly.
That really challenges those economic arguments.
Yeah.
It also brings up that related idea, can wealth really protect us?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea that it's better to be in a strong building in a storm than a weak one.
Yeah.
Is there a limit to that protection when it comes to climate change?
Dr. Guenther argues forcefully that there's no evidence that these protections are unlimited. That idea actually has roots in economic theory, specifically from a growth theorist named Robert Solow.
Solow.
Yes. He theorized that technological innovation could potentially allow human productivity to increase indefinitely, sort of overcoming resource limits.
Okay, a theory.
Just a theory, as Solow himself apparently stressed. But economists advising figures like Reagan and Thatcher back in the 80s, they apparently took this idea as gospel.
How so?
They used it to argue that you could essentially ignore environmental externalities, the hidden costs like pollution, as long as overall wealth was increasing. The belief was sort of that wealth itself could buy infinite immunity.
A dangerous belief, it sounds like.
Especially now. As Dr. Guenther says, the whole spectacle of our planet heating up this quickly should call all of those economic assumptions into question.
So the theory breaks down spectacularly when faced with the reality of the climate crisis.
Precisely. And it connects to that misleading argument that, poverty is the real problem because climate change hits poorer communities first.
Right, I've heard that argument.
Dr. Guenther clarifies, yes, it often starts there, hitting the most vulnerable first. But, she warns, this is a slow-moving but accelerating crisis that will root and spread.
It won't stay contained.
No. And it could change for the worst quite dramatically as we hit tipping points. It's not just a problem for some. Eventually, it's a problem for everyone. Wealth won't provide infinite protection.
So to really crystallize this difference between the slow warming and the sudden shifts, is there a final analogy Dr. Guenther uses?
Yes, she highlights one preferred by Dr. Joel Gergis, who's an IPCC lead author. Dr. Gergis says climate change isn't like planetary diabetes.
Planetary diabetes.
Meaning, like a chronic condition you can sort of manage, bumble along with, using treatments and technology to sustain relative health.
Okay, not like that. So what is it like?
It's more like a cancer. A disease that takes hold, grows, metastasizes, until it reaches a point where it's no longer curable and becomes terminal.
That's much starker.
It is. And that terminal stage, Dr. Guenther notes, you could also think of that as a tipping point. It really underscores the potential finality of these shifts.
Yeah. That spaceship analogy, the cancer analogy.
Yeah.
They really land the gravity of the situation.
So bringing this all together, what does this mean for us? For our personal motivation, especially for listeners trying to stay informed, maybe those preparing for exams like the UPSC.
Dr. Guenther frames it very directly as a fight for life. And like any fight, she says, it demands a tremendous amount of bravery.
Bravery, not just fear. Exactly. She talks about her own motivation protecting the world for her son, for all children. She calls it a fierce protectiveness that comes from love. And she believes love is an infinite resource, ultimately more powerful than greed or hate.
A fight for life fueled by love and bravery.
That's the essence of it. A powerful call, really reminding us what's at stake and where our strength might lie.
This has been a really crucial deep dive today. We've unpacked that vital difference between gradual change and tipping points. We've challenged those, frankly, dangerous narratives about reassuring warming levels. We've looked at how fear can be productive if channeled correctly. And we've really debunked those economic models that just ignore catastrophic risk. It's a perspective that's absolutely essential, I think, for anyone engaging with current affairs, whether you're studying for an exam or just committed to being truly well-informed.
And it really leaves us with a profound question, doesn't it? If Dr. Guenther is right, if love is this infinite resource, this incredibly strong motivator, well, how do we as individuals, as societies, actually harness that power more effectively for this fight? How do we turn that fear and that love into tangible, collective, brave action?
Powerful question to ponder. We really encourage you to continue your own deep dive into these vital topics.
Oh.
If you found this discussion useful, please do like this deep dive, subscribe for more insights like this, and definitely leave a comment below if you have questions or thoughts you want to share. Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.